Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to this idyn online partner training. In this session, my colleague Richard will train you how to implement ConnectIT 365 for Business Central. Before we get started, today and Thursday includes 4 training sessions. You can still join the other sessions on Thursday via idyn.nl/news. Before we dive into this session, I want to take a quick moment to run you through some highlights of the solutions. Direct banking. Save 80%. Wait 1 second. Yeah. Save 80% of your daily banking processing time with direct banking. Connect to EU banks with Ponto and worldwide with the Co-based bank connector. ShipIT 365. Connect to over 1,200 carriers in Business Central. Connect to the Nshift Delivery Hub, Nshift Transmart, and Sendcloud. So you can now, starting Q1 2023, you can connect to multiple carrier vendors. To take ShipIT one step further, you can also integrate it into the task with mobile AMS to pick, pack, and ship directly from your handheld device. ConnectIT, that's the subject of today. It's the connectivity toolkit for developers and Business Central users. Import and export data with a wide range of methods and data formats. Approve it, excuse me. Sign, store, and automate follow-up of your quotes in Business Central with Approve 365. Connect Business Central to DocuSign. Let your customers safely e-sign your sales quotes directly from Business Central. This is a new solution by idyn. You can join the session tomorrow afternoon, Thursday afternoon. If you go to idyn.nl/news, the first link will get you to the training registrations. Dino, that's a relatively small pay-to-use app that we have. Create any field, any table on any page in Business Central. Simply add fields, and starting 2023, you can also edit tables in Business Central directly. Object Manager Advanced. This solution probably doesn't need any introduction. It's the all-you-need developer tool for NAV and Business Central. So let's dive into today's session. Let's dive into today's session. If you have any questions, ask them in the question tab. We will have a Q&A session at the end, but if there is a question that relates to a topic that we are discussing, we can create some time to actually answer your question at the end of a topic. If you still want to join the other training sessions, you can still register yourself for the ShipIT and the Approve It session on Thursday. I would like to give the word to my colleagues. Are you ready?
Yep. Okay. So now my screen should be visible. So welcome to the ConnectIT training that we are starting, where we will discuss primarily everything that has changed for the latest release. We will dive into all the highlights in a bit more detail than we did in the highlight session. And as already mentioned, if you have any questions, just write them in the question tab, and we will make sure that not only do we have a Q&A, but if there are questions regarding the topic that we're discussing, we're we will try to make sure that we answer those questions during the topic to make sure that you don't have to wait almost 2 hours to get your answer. So let's start. Well, of course, we already heard the benefits, so I will skip this page for now. So today's topics, as discussed with in the highlight session for ConnectIT, we had an additional release in January where we added some stuff like a new method for intercompany synchronization, some administration with the project management where we could group definitions, and we added some more JSON export options, primarily focusing on multiple array options. And then in the beginning of March, we had a release of 21.6, where we added a new action on for new records on the import, and we included a beta feature management, where we included 3 beta options that are optionally can be enabled by users. And we have some new functions as well, and we will see them later on. And of course, at the end, we will have the option for a Q&A. So let's actually dive into the topics. I will switch between the presentation and a Business Central environment to make sure that we look into this during the topic instead of afterwards, to hopefully make it a bit easier to understand. So let's start with intercompany. In January, we included this option. We included this option. Some partners already have seen this method in a custom extension, but we included it in the standard to make it a bit easier, and since there was more demand for it. This is a method that's both available in the import and export definitions, where in the export definitions we actually do the configuration, and on the import definition it's strictly to make sure that those are the only import definitions where the data can be processed, and to make sure that when we actually run imports through the scheduler, that we don't try to get some file or some data from somewhere else. The way it works is for this method we require both an export definition and an import definition, and from the export definition we will create not only an export entry like we would normally, but in this process we will also create a new import entry in the company that we want to send the data to. Now I will show you in a minute that we have multiple ways to configure the definitions, and as you can see, we have 3 options available. We can send the data to a single company, we can send the data to all companies or all other companies, because of course we exclude the current company where we export the data from, and we can also export the data to a specified list of companies in the scenario where you have multiple companies available, but you don't want to export it to all companies. So if we look at the BC client, when we go to the exports, I have one already prepared from the highlight session over here. So here we can see this is a simple export for customer containing pretty much all data from the customer, or at the very least all data that's not in flow fields available. Before we actually discuss those intercompany options, one thing that's also good to know is that with the latest release we now also can see some additional info. And one of these things is actually the class of the fields. This will probably make it a bit easier to get the correct fields, because for synchronization, flow fields don't really matter, flow filters don't really matter because we can't process them. That doesn't mean that we will get an error if we try to process them, but the fields will simply be skipped since we can't actually write data directly to those fields. So in the case of a synchronization between companies, it makes sense to only include normal fields. And also included right now is the type of the field to make it a bit more clear what we actually try to import or export. So this is also available from the import side. When we look at the intercompany options, we can simply select the intercompany from the method over here. And if I go back to manually, we will see that we actually lose some of the information. And if we go back to intercompany, we will see we get 2 additional sections. The first one is the basic intercompany configuration, where we can decide if we want to send the data to all companies or to one company. And the second is the company list. And this list will only be available if we don't select the copy to all companies. So if I select this one, that list will disappear since we don't have any need for it. So if I disable that option, we will get the list back, and from there we can determine what to do. So the 3 options that we have available, once again, switching back to copy to all companies. In that case, we don't expect the company name to be filled in because we simply use all other companies, and we can select an import definition number. Of course, this requires that the import definition that we want to send the data to has the same number in all companies and is also present, of course, in all companies. You can see we have a lookup over here, and that lookup actually looks at the other companies to look at the available import definitions. However, keep in mind, if we select copy to all companies, this will try to get the import definitions from the first company it will find other than the current one. So let's actually look if we have any data over there. Well, we actually have. So here we can see we see a list of the import definitions from the other companies. In this case, we only have one available, and that's because it's filtered by method and whether or not it's active. And from there we can select it. So this will try to send the data to all other companies. In this case, we have 3 companies where I believe we're currently in the international Cronus International, yes. So it will try to send it to both the demo company and the sync company. Now, if we disable this option, the second way we can do things is simply select one company. You see, since I have now selected another company, the import definition number will be cleared, and we can try to find some more data. Here you can see actually that since I have selected another company, the import definitions that will be shown over here are the definitions, the import definitions available in that company only. So right now it will look at that Cronus Sync company, and we can see that we actually have another definition available as well to process it. It probably is a copy of the first one. Yeah. So if we select that, we see that we have now this import definition available, and this will allow the export to only synchronize to this company using this import definition. One thing that's also good to note is this lookup, of course, since we are looking into the other companies, requires that we actually have read permission on the import definitions in that other company. Now, the third option that we have available, for that I will clear the company name and the import definition, is with the company list. And this is something that we can use if we have multiple companies, but we don't want to copy or want to synchronize the data to all other companies, or perhaps we do want to copy it to all other companies. However, it might use another import definition number. So here we have the same lookup available, but in this case, the lookup, of course, is separate for each company. So right now we can see that we selected the other two companies, but with a different import definition number. What you can also see over here is that we can actually also select the current company over here. If we set the copy to all companies, or if we enable that option, then it will be excluded and we will only sync to the other companies. However, we can actually, and the same goes for here, we can actually synchronize with the current company. There might be some scenarios where that might come in handy if we want to update some data. However, do be careful because if you have an export that is based, that uses table monitoring and that looks for changes, and we process an import in the same table for the same record, that can, of course, create a loop. So that's something that that you really need to take a loop at before configuring something like that. And if that's required, then it might be necessary to make sure that we have the table monitoring and for only a few fields. So in this case, we actually exclude fields. But in that scenario, it might be required to only look at changes in certain fields to make sure that that doesn't cause a loop. However, that isn't the case, of course, if we synchronize to other companies, unless, of course, in those companies we synchronize back. That's also something to take to consider. So what we I will actually set it back to where I had it before and send it to one company. Okay, and this was the customer. So, and while we do have table monitor available that it checks for changes, I of course can also process it in another way. Let's make sure what customers we have available. Probably only the Cronus customers. Yeah. So in this case, I will do an export. In this case, I will be using the direct export to use a temporary filter. And this should allow us to only send a couple of customers. Yeah, 6 in total. One thing that wasn't in the highlight session, but is something that we actually also have improved, is that we have included some additional navigational links to other pages, like the export entries. In this case, it's already empty, and that will filter it also so that we will only see it for the current definition. And if we check the log over here, then we see that we have in total 6 exports here in the log available. And if we switch to the, it's the demo company actually. We probably, yeah, we still have 6 import entries because there's no scheduling at the moment. So these are, the import entries are created over here with the same data. However, those are not yet processed because currently those are waiting for the scheduler to actually execute, or the job queue entry, I should say. One thing that is good to know with regards to this configuration is if we choose the real-time export option over here, it will also handle the import as a real-time import. So the data will be processed pretty much directly with the help of some background tasks. But that makes sure that the data is processed pretty much in real time. Of course, if that's not selected, then it will simply be handled like all other scheduled exports and imports, and it requires the idyn task scheduler to be set up in the job queue entries. One thing that I already mentioned, but that's also good to take a look at, and that will be the last thing for the intercompany. In this case, I haven't actually set up the lines in this company. So on the import side, as already seen in the lookups, is that we require also the method intercompany to be set and the import definition to be set to active. However, you don't have any options available over here because all handling, all processing is already done by the export definition. This is simply to allow us to process data and perhaps set up a recurrence. Yeah, that's one thing that is can also come quite in handy if you have a lot of companies. Is actually our copy functionality. That is something that was already available, but especially in regards to the intercompany functionality, it makes sense to use it over here and to show it actually. So in the backup menu, we have the copy to option, and in this copy to option, we see all other companies where we can copy this definition to as well. So we don't need to export it from the current company and import it to the other company. We can actually copy the definition to all other companies as well, where we can simply select which company to copy the data to. Here we can also see if it already exists. That will simply check on the import definition number. If there is already a definition existing with the same number in that company. However, we can still copy to that company as well, but instead of creating a new import definition, we will update the existing import definition. So if, for instance, you have 10 or 20 companies in this list, you can select which companies to copy the definition to and simply select copy to process the data. That does pretty much the same thing as an import from a file, but without leaving the original company, which might make the administration a bit easier. That is all there is for the intercompany part. I don't know if there are any questions so far.
There are currently no questions yet.
Oh.
If you have any questions, send them in the chat box. We will discuss them during the Q&A session. Back to you, Richard.
Okay, thank you. In that case, we will move on to the next part. So, project management is something that's primarily done for some administration. Once again, might come quite in handy if you have a lot of definitions or a lot of companies to easily import and export data. However, there is some more functionality behind this that will allow us to actually look if there are errors for definitions or entries for the same project. And the reason why we included this is that sometimes, or for some customers, especially when we're talking about synchronization, the processing order or the execution order is pretty important, so that if an earlier entry results in an error, we don't want to process entries after that until that error is solved or the entry is removed. So back to the client, and projects are available from the additional setup. So here you can see the two projects that I created for the highlight session. We can see the basic setup over here and how many times they are used for import and export definitions. And if we open one of those, we can see those same options, of course, and we can see which definitions are linked to this project. So, of course, we have a code for the project, we have a description, we can set it to blocked, which will, if this is set to blocked and we try to execute one of these definitions that is linked to the project, that will result in an error. In normal usage, you shouldn't do that, of course, but there might be a reason to block projects, maybe temporary. And in the processing, we can see we can set if we want to stop import on error and export on error, and those are separated. So we can choose if we want to stop processing for either flow. In this case, I haven't configured that. I have disabled these options. So whenever an error occurs, it won't block the next entry from processing. But if I were to select this option and I would do two imports where the first import results in an error, then the second will also result in an error that there is a previous error available, which will stop the processing for that entry, of course, as well. And in that error, we can also see which entry caused the process to stop. This should probably also be visible, of course, in the import entries. And since they are ordered by import entry number, the first one should be the one that result in the issue. But of course, during processing, if we try to reprocess an error, that's something that might not it might be that's not so easily found in that overview. Additionally, we have some actions available over here as well. And these are pretty much the same actions as we have available on the definitions for backup options, where we can export and import the project and copy it to the archive. When we export the project, we will get all data for the project, including the complete definition or the content of the import and export definitions. So here you can actually see that we get all definitions, and this is how a normal import definition looks like when we export it separately. But this allows us to process it all together. Actually, if we do this, we can see that we, oh, that still doesn't allow for that. So here we can see the basic info that is visible on the project record itself. And we have some additional info when it was exported and which user exported the data. Additionally, and that's also visible in the exports for the definitions, is that we have some version info in the available as well. This might come in handy if we want to troubleshoot. So here we can actually see which version of the Business Central application was used, what the platform version is, and the base application version, if it's a production environment, and if it's a cloud environment, and of course also the ConnectIT app itself and which version is used, since most troubleshooting starts at which version was actually used when an error occurred. So that's simply that's info that won't be processed during an import of a definition, but is still exported. So we ignore that during import. One thing that's also different actually from the definition export is that we include the definition number here. Now, in normal definition exports, we exclude that number, so every definition export will result into a file where the definition number is missing. So when we try to import it, it will always see it as a new definition, unless of course we use the archive and restore from archive. But there we already know which definition the backup was for. In this case, however, if we try to process the project, we will take a look at the definition number, and from there look if the definition already exists. So with this, we can also update existing definitions and complete projects and all definitions included in the project. And of course, thing that's good to know is where we can set up those project links. So if we go back into this intercompany definition and scroll down to the bottom, we can see that we have the project section over here, where we can select which project this definition belongs to. And that's pretty much all there is for projects. It was a bit less than, of course, than the intercompany methods. So once again, to make sure, are there any questions so far regarding this topic?
No, there are not questions yet. There are no questions yet. If you have a question, please ask them in the question bar. Yeah, and we will discuss them during the Q&A or after the following. If you have a question about the next topic, we will discuss them after the next topic. Let's continue.
Okay, great. So next part is the JSON options that were included in the January release. However, there is also one topic over here that we actually recently included as well in the latest release, and that's the last point that we see over here. So with JSON, we have a lot of options available with regards to how the data is structured, or I should say the JSON options are include quite a lot of options including simple JSON objects, arrays, arrays based on values. However, there in the previous version, we only allowed for those arrays to be handled on data item lines, which limited us to only showing arrays when we had multiple records. However, since then we have included the array option, or allowed for the array option on the other line types as well. So helper, field, and constant lines all allow for the array option with different behavior for all of those line types. And with these options, we can now create arrays in the output based on a single data item or record. And we can also create value arrays, so arrays containing only certain values. There is a limitation over there where these values are only from the same record. So we can simply currently create a value array with values from different records. That's the limitation there. And the last part is that currently we have a new option available as well, where we can combine arrays. And that's something that I can show you in a bit, where we previously, if we had arrays or nodes with the same element name, that would result in an error. That is still the case if we simply use a single node, so without the array option, because that of course isn't allowed in JSON within the same node at the very least, or on the same level. But if we have an array, we can now actually set a second line with the same element name, and as long as we also configure that as an array, then it will be combined into a single array. So first things first, are the first two options are actually available in this definition. I will enlarge this part. So here we can already see something that wasn't available before. I will make this a bit smaller so we can actually see where the array option is set. So here we can see that we have an helper available where we have set up an array. Once again, previously before 21.5, that wasn't possible. That I believe this option was grayed out. But right now we allow it for the helper. And if we do this, we can make sure that everything below that is handled as an array. Now, there is a second helper over here, which is different from the data item. So if we look at data item, if we choose to use an array on that, that will both handle the array and all the objects in the array. However, with the helper, we have split the array option and the object within the array, simply because this allows us to use multiple helpers or multiple objects in that array, but also because if we were to process fields directly in this helper array, that would result in a value array. So that's something that we can actually see over here. So if we look at this output, we can see we have this address info array. So let's look if we can actually split those to hopefully see something over here. Yeah, here we can see that helper address info, that's the array option. And within that array, we have another helper where we have the cell2 address info and a different helper where we have the build2 address info, all from the same record in the sales header. And this is the first helper that we see over here. And this is the second helper. So both helpers within that array are responsible to create a different object within that array. And with regards to that value array, where we have a single helper that's set up with the array option, there we have included all those fields below that. And you can actually see that that's also called address info. And we have set up in such a way that it will create an array without additional objects. Those values are directly inserted into the array. Now you also see over here that I have selected an element name, which also implies that there is that those belong to the array. That isn't necessary. This is simply just for clarification what this is. However, those element names are simply ignored in this option. So I could have left those blank as well. But this allows me to clearly communicate what is expected over here. One additional thing that wasn't actually on the presentation is what we see over here. That seems like a small detail, but is quite important. So previously, if we once again, if we had the data item at the top, if we start with the sales header and start with an array, that would allow us to directly start with an array as well. However, if we select a helper first, then previously that would result into an empty node being added before the array. So right now, if I select the element name over here and try to process this again, this will actually create a new object before the sales header array. But since the 21.5 release, if we leave this initial element blank, if we choose to use a helper, then it will simply create an empty object or an object without a name as the root node for the message. And that in turn allows us to use a data item with an array below that. And that was simply something that was missing in a previous version. So that is a small change, but can result in a more flexible configuration of our JSON messages. As for the last part, I've set up a different definition for this. And if we look at the lines here, we can see a few things that we also saw previously. So we have, once again, a helper array and a helper within a helper, but also a data item, or in this case, actually two, and once again, a helper. And the interesting thing here is, for now, ignore that field with the same name because that's on a different level, so that shouldn't matter anyway. But those three lines for the helpers and data items all have the same element name, and all include the array option. And those are placed on the same level with the same parent line, so the same node as a root node, as it were. So those should be placed in the same JSON object or JSON array, depending on the configuration. Previously, as mentioned, this would result in an error that the object was already present in the definition. However, with this configuration, this will no longer happen, and instead we will check if we start processing with the address array, if we already have an address array in that same JSON object available. And if that's the case, then we will simply retrieve all the data already in the array and add to the existing array. So this allows us, if I clear the filter here, to, for instance, start with the sales header, and from there start an array for the address info and get, for instance, data from the header into that array. So in this case, the ship to information, get information from the lines as well. In this case, we only have a location code, but I've added an additional data item there to get the address info from the location. And then we end with a helper array once again to get the build to information, just to show you that the order shouldn't matter for processing this. In this scenario, we could also process an additional data item that has no link whatsoever to that root data item or the parent data item. So if we process this, we can see we now have one address array. But we can also see that the information, in this case ship to, build to, and location from the lines, is all included in the same address array. What we can also see is that these JSON objects within the array don't necessarily line up, because that's not a requirement in JSON. So they can contain different elements, different nodes actually, where we can see that we have a location subnode for the lines, but we don't have a subnode within the other the ship to and build to address info. And this, so we can actually see that parts of this message, so this part and this latest part, are all belonging to the same sales header record. And this part is actually only the part that comes from the lines. And this can also be used, of course, in other ways, that we include other data items or other structures as well. But once again, this allows for simply a bit of more flexibility. This was already partially possible with XML, because XML does well, the way that the node lists or the arrays work is of course a bit different, where it is allowed to have multiple tags with the same name, and from there it is actually already processed as a node list instead of a single node. Let's go back here. And of course, this also works in combination with filters, with linking to other data items as well. So once again, that should allow for a bit of more flexibility, especially with JSON exports. So I think that we should move on with the next subject. So once again, just before we continue, Are there any questions so far?
There are currently no questions in the questions tab. To repeat myself again, if you have any questions, put them in the questions tab in the GoToWebinar, and we will get to them.
Okay, so now we will actually continue with the current release, or the March release, or Q1 release, however you want to put it. So with this latest release, we added some options, and one of those options were to also allow a decision when we want to process new records. Previously, we only had options available for existing records, where we could decide whether we want to update or ignore or skip or recreate those records. However, the default action for new records was to simply create those records. Those who remember the CL version or the NAV version of ConnectIT know that this was actually an option that was available in that version, where you could choose what the behavior was for new records. So this is now added once again, with one difference. In that version, we also had an error option to explicitly return an error. Maybe if there are enough customers that really want that option, then we could take a look at that. But for now, we have two options available. We can simply create the new record, which is the default action, and should also be the default when we create a new line with a data item, or we can simply do nothing, so skip the record. Which might make sense, for instance, if we want to process certain data or update certain data, which only needs to be processed if the record already exists. And I know for certain that there are some partners that created solutions previously for this based on our events to make sure that we own only existing records were processed. But that's something that's now also available in the standard. So if we go back to the web client, and in this case, of course, we will go to the import definitions. Inlines, well, basically the same as the screenshot we just saw in the presentation. Here we can decide if we want to create new records or do nothing. What this means is if we do nothing in the item, we also don't process the child data items. So if we do nothing with the item, we don't do anything, of course, with the unit of measure and item unit of measure, even though those are set to create. Of course, we could also do it like this. However, one do keep in mind that this could result in a failure if we don't process a new unit of measure, but we do process an item unit of measure based on that unit of measure, since those are on the same level. So in this case, only the unit of measure won't be processed, and the rest of the data items are processed. Let's set this to create and here to do nothing. So if we look in at this import, what we actually say is we only want to process existing items right now. Updates on existing records are allowed, but if we process a new item, that will simply skip the process. So I believe I already have it. Yeah, have one import file over here. So here we can see multiple items in this import. But I believe if we look at the last item, That's an item that does not exist yet. Oh, no, that's okay. Yeah, that was to be expected. No. Yeah. So currently this item is not present in this environment. So when I try to process this, and this should be the same file. Once again, also for the import definitions, we have included some navigation options. So here we can check actually in the imported records. So far we only have entries from the 8th of March during the highlight session. And if we check actually if the import is successful, then we can see that it is actually successful. So just to show you that if we set it back to create and then try to process this, this should result in a new record, or actually multiple new records, since also the item unit measure is processed. So we can see that we have the new item as well. One thing to note, if we leave this blank, and I need to modify something here, of course, since otherwise we don't have any new records. And go to process. This should result in an error because we haven't selected an option. It is good to know that currently this error won't occur for unstructured import, so not for Excel and CSV. So there, the default action, if we leave it blank, it will still create the new record or process the new record. However, for structured imports currently, this will return an error if we don't select anything. So of course, we then need to decide what we want to do. Actually, I should be able to process from here. Yeah. And then we can continue. So as mentioned just now, if we create a new line with a data item, let's see if this actually does what it needs to do. And it seems like that's only when we actually update. Yeah, that's okay. So if we choose a data item, and that's something in the future as well that we will include, that we actually create a new line, that it will also automatically choose create. The default value will be create. And as well with the data upgrades, if you had already had existing, or your customer already had existing import definitions, those should also be automatically updated as well, provided that you use the upgrade action for cloud. Of course, that is done automatically with an update. For on-premise, you do need to choose the correct option. So if you uninstall and install it once again, it will probably skip the data upgrade. But if you simply upgrade it from PowerShell, then all the existing line should also be updated as well to by default be configured to set to create, to make sure that the processing is done in the same way as before. And from there you can choose to, of course, modify the existing definitions. Yeah, so that's the part regarding the import action on new records. So once again, are there any questions for now?
There are no questions in the questions tab. So let's continue. And if you have any questions, we can discuss them during the Q&A at the end.
Okay, in that case, we will continue with the next section, which discusses the beta features. So first of all, we will discuss the features in a moment, but first I would like to discuss how we can simply enable and disable or check the current setting. So the beta features are available from the setup. With the enable beta features option, we can also search for them over here and see that we can simply go to the page directly. But for now, I will use this action. So here we have the beta features available, and here we can also see the current status. So we can see that we have 2 of the 3 current features that are currently available enabled. We can see the short description, what it does, and we can also go to the online manual to get more info regarding that feature. If I want to enable or disable a feature, I will get a question if I want to continue, just to make sure that we don't by accident simply enable or disable a feature. So this is a question that you need to answer. Default answer is no, to make sure that we don't just click a couple of times and enable or disable a feature, but we can also see when it was last enabled and the last user that modified the feature as well. The first feature where I already clicked that one, where we can actually, where we already saw the online manual, is the advanced scheduling options. So in the previous version, for each definition, we only had one export schedule. I can actually show that as well. If I select a random definition. So going to recurrence, we had the real-time export option and the recurring job. And with recurring job, we had some default options very similar to what we see in the job queue entries, where you can select which days to run, starting and ending time, and the number of minutes between runs, which made sure that we had where we could determine the frequency in combination of the in combination with the job queue entry frequency, of course. So with the feature enabled, we can also see that we have this advanced schedule feature, but we can also select it. So if we disable the feature, actually, let's quickly do that. Yes. We should also see that option as well, but we can't actually edit it. So it's grayed out for now. So let's enable it again. Those features work on check on the open page in this case. So if you have, that's why I open and close the page, the cart page, to make sure that the feature is checked once again. So right now we can edit it and enable it, and we get another section where we can set up the advanced recurrence settings. And for that, I have prepared another definition where we already have set up some cycles. So here we can see a couple of things. First of all, we can define multiple schedules for a single definition, which might come in handy if we want to process certain data with different intervals. And the second thing that we also have available is that we have more options available regarding the execution or the execution cycle. So previously, by default, we checked for the days where when we would execute the definitions, and we set the number of minutes between runs. That's pretty similar to the minute option that we have available over here, where we set up the interval for the amount of minutes. So this is 50 minutes in between runs, and this runs for on Monday through Fridays, starting at 5 until 7:20, and with a starting date that's currently set up for tomorrow. So this currently is not allowed to execute today, since it's only active from tomorrow, and it doesn't have an ending date with active still. So after starting from tomorrow from 5 a.m., this definition will process every 15 minutes at the very least early in the morning. And after that, and that's something that is available if we set it to active, in office hours, we've set it up to run every hour with an interval of 1, so 1 hour, and where we don't have an active from an active till. So this is always active, provided of course that we set the recurrence schedule to active. If we look at the next option, we have day also available, where we simply set it to once a day, and in this case we only want to set it to in the weekends. So this is allowed to execute on Saturday and Sunday, starting from 5 a.m. We don't have an ending time over here. We can't actually set an ending time over here, since it's not a schedule where we have a recurring interval like minutes or hours. So this simply looks at the earliest starting time of 5 a.m. And once the job queue runs and it's after 5 a.m., then this is allowed to execute. We have 2 more setup options over here that I haven't set up yet. So, but for now, let's look at the month. So this is set up with the interval of a month. Of course, we can select a day in that option, since we simply check with a calc date if it's already allowed to be executed, where we have a starting time of 3 a.m. Once again, no ending time, since it's not recurring on the same day. with an active from until period. And this here we can actually see just before we started with this session, this was also executed. So we can see that the last runtime was actually today. So the next time this is allowed to run is actually on the 21st of April, since that will be the next month. Then we have two more options. So we also have the weekly option. Of course, with an interval 1 week was something that we could already do. But if you want to run it bi-weekly, for instance, we can set it up like this. We can still select the day over here so that we can decide which day it actually needs to run. It is still possible to set multiple days. However, that doesn't really make sense in this case because, of course, it will still check if, in this case, if an interval of 2 weeks has gone by since the last run. Once again, no ending time needed and not even possible to enter, and we can only give in a starting time. If we don't specify a starting time, it will simply try to start from midnight, depending, of course, on when the job queue entry runs. Just to make sure that this isn't accidentally processed in between. And then we have the last option, and that's date formula. And here we can't actually enter the interval. Instead, we use the next run date formula, which is pretty similar to what's also available in the job queue entries, where we can specify a custom interval or a custom date formula to allow us to specify the next time this should be executed. And of course, that calculates from the last running date. And as long as the current date time, or current date in this case, is later than the last run date time with a calc date using that date formula, then it will be allowed to execute. Once again, we can select the days here because that doesn't make sense here, but we can use a starting time to make sure that we don't execute it too early in the day. And an ending time is also possible over here. In this case, I will actually delete this. Just as with the normal options, first of all, it's good to know that even with this beta feature enabled, the old recurring job is still available. So this also checks if the recurring job is enabled, and then it will simply go with the old route and not look at the advanced options. But for both options, for both the recurring job and the advanced schedules, we of course need the job queue entries to run. And just as a quick reminder, since I do get a couple of questions now, every once in a while, if we look at the job queue entry, we have the idyn task scheduler set up over here with the parameter string export, and we also have one for import, of course. And here we can decide which days it needs to run. So this is set up to run on weekdays in this environment, with, of course, some standard options like the maximum number of attempts if an error occurs and a rerun delay, and of course the interval here. So for both those options, for both the old recurring job and the new advanced schedules, those will only be checked if the task scheduler is executed through the job queue. And from there, it will take a look at all those intervals if a definition is allowed to be executed. since we have multiple schedules, we already saw a part of it. Those schedules independently have a last run option available. Of course, I need to set it up like this to see the data. So the way that the scheduler handles these cycles is that if the task scheduler is run with the job queue entry, it will check for each definition if it's allowed to execute. And that means that if multiple cycles are defined for that definition, then it will check in order if it's active, if the starting time, if it's already past the starting time and not yet the ending time, if it's active, and active, of course, with the date window as well. And finally, it will take a look at the last run time. If during that process, one of these schedules is well, if ConnectIT comes to the conclusion that one of these schedules is allowed to run during that execution, it will take that schedule. It will not look for multiple schedules at a time if it's allowed to execute multiple times. However, do keep in mind, if you have overlapping schedules, that at the first execution of the job queue entry of the task scheduler, we will find the first recurrence that is allowed to execute, and with the second run, we will also get, of course, the second schedule that is allowed to run if there are overlapping schedules. So in this case, here we could have a scenario where the monthly and the the daily or the cycles for a minute an hour could be allowed to process on the same day during the same execution of the task scheduler. And you will see in the last run entry, last run daytime for each schedule, you will see separately when the last time was when it was executed. And that is also, of course, used to determine the next execution or the earliest next execution date time. Before moving on to the second beta feature, are there any questions regarding the advanced scheduling?
This question I just overlooked during like 10 minutes ago. I don't know if this question can be answered now or during the Q&A. When setting up definitions, are custom extension fields also pulled into the selection?
Oh, yeah.
Is it better to answer during the Q&A?
Yeah.
Okay, then I will hold it for the Q&A.
Yeah, so just to clarify, that is something we can discuss during Q&A, which actually has a simple answer, but is not related to the subjects that we're currently discussing. But of course, we have some time left, so we can answer that question in the session. For now, we will continue actually with the second beta feature, which allows us to export with the data format Excel and CSV, which was previously limited to 2 data items for an export, or a maximum of 2 data items, depending on the configuration. And this limitation is now not there anymore if the beta feature is enabled. If it's not enabled, you will still get the same limitations as before. Do keep in mind, there still is a limitation, And that's simply because when we're handling unstructured data, we can't simply allow for multiple arrays on the same level. So there are some options with multiple arrays if it's all in the same structure, but we can't allow for multiple arrays next to each other because that wouldn't make sense in flat data. So I will show you in the web clients one example over here. So in this environment, we have enabled this beta feature, and that allows us to set up multiple data relations. So here we actually have a third data item that previously would return an error when we try to enter this. So this is allowed. However, do keep in mind we have selected an array for the sales line here, which is with the parent sales header. So if we have another, if we try to add another data item as a child for the sales header and also try to add that as an array, that will fail. However, we can actually add another data item which isn't an array, and I believe I have that set up over here as an example. So here we can actually, see that we have the item as the root data item, and below that we have an item variant with an array and an item unit of measure, and that's linked in a way that we only get the item unit of measure for the base unit of measure. However, if we were to add this as an array, that would fail because we can't have two arrays on the same level to the same data item. Because then we couldn't properly translate that to a flat file in the export. But we can set those data items next to each other as long as a maximum of one is added as an array over here. And after that, this is not set up as an array, then we can actually also set up another data item within that, as long, once again, that isn't an array. We could also change that around. So this, for example, would be allowed. So here we can actually see we have these two data items on the same level, both linked onto the item. But once again, one without an array, one with an array. So that's allowed. And then in that data item where we have set up an array, we can once again set up a data item below that as a child with an array, since that still makes sense in the export. In this case, it doesn't make sense because we know that if we link the unit of measure as a child from the item unit of measure, we always get one record back. But technically, that is allowed. Going back to the table relation in this Excel export. So we have set this up as a flat file with an header. And we have set it up in such a way that we get the sales header, the sales lines, and related to the sales lines, some information about the item. For those who have also seen the highlight session, I believe I have set up a filter over here. Yeah, for a specific sales document, in this case an invoice, where we also have lines available that aren't actually that don't contain an item. So if we export this, And unfortunately, that opens in a different window. So here we can see it's simply 4 lines, so it doesn't look that interesting at first glance. However, there are some interesting things to be considered over here. When we look at this definition, we can see we get the document type and a document number from the sales header. So those are these columns. And then we get some information from the sales line and actually some information after that as well. And then in between we get some columns with regards to the item. So these 4 columns belong to the item. Actually, to make oh, this one is actually not in the output, so it's actually 3 columns. So this is all part from the item, and everything left blank is from the sales line. This part simply wasn't possible before. And that simply with this beta feature is now also available. And one thing also to note, as mentioned, we don't only have items over here, but we also have a command line and a general ledger account over here, which don't actually have has any relation to the item table. And previously, this would have only exported these 2 lines because we always looked at the relation between those data items had records in both tables. So in that case, if we would take items from the sales lines, we only would get these 2 lines. Right now, you can actually see we have 2 lines, one without a number and one with a number that isn't an item. Then we can see what we still have those lines available, so we get the rest of the information as well. But we can simply see that this does not generate any data, but the columns are still intact because we still get the additional columns for the sales line after the empty item columns. This, of course, is the same way that also CSV exports or text exports would work because the handling of that is pretty similar, but of course with a different output. One thing that is good to know, since there is a change in the handling of the output, where we don't now also allow records in the output that don't necessarily include child records. We also need to make sure that it is still possible to only include records that are that have records in both or all tables, and that's actually something that we can solve with our output conditions. So previously, output conditions returned an error upon opening it for Excel and CSV. Right now, it is allowed for data items. If we try to select it for other fields, then it will return an error, because of course in CSV or Excel, it doesn't make sense to set output conditions based for a single field, because that would break the way that the data is ordered. But it is possible to allow it for output conditions. So here, I believe, I've set up a temporary value in the functions, but the temporary value, well, in this case, it will probably still remain have its values, but we can actually make sure that we clear it before that. So we could also use one of the other functions that was included, I believe, in December. So right now what we're doing is we're clearing the temporary value, make sure that's empty. We set it up over here, but that means that the temporary value will only be set for lines that have a record or related record in the item table, and then that's something that we can also use with the output conditions, where we can simply mention that we only want to have records that are where the item or the vendor item number has a value. That's one way of handling it, and that would make sure that we only get those lines back that actually contain records in the item table. In this case, actually only records that contain a vendor item number. So we could also set it up on the number instead to make sure that way we know when there is an actual relation or a record found, and that would limit our output as well, making sure that we can still get the same output as before, because sometimes we do need exports where we only need to export data when there are records in all related or in some related data items. I believe I actually also, oh no, I didn't skip this part. So, and that's also, of course, the reason why it's added as a beta feature, to make sure that we don't break existing exports, but we can simply, where the customer can decide to enable or disable this feature. Of course, once you enable that feature, you do need to check if the expected output is still the same for your existing Excel and CSV exports. And before, of course, we take a look at the logging, that will probably be a short one because there's not much to see actually. Once again, for now, are there any questions related to this Excel or CSV export?
No new questions were added about this topic.
Okay, in that case, we will continue with the next part. This is what I just said. This is not something that I actually, well, it's not really that interesting to see because there isn't much to see in the processing, because this is all done in the background. But just this is something that's was also discussed in the highlights session. Currently, without this beta feature enabled, all logging is done through API requests to the ConnectIT API, and this is done to make sure that we don't log any tables unnecessarily during the process, because it would be a shame if we were to log the logging, the detailed logging records during the process, because if we set up the logging level for debug or detailed information, we get a lot of log lines back during processing. So we did take a look if it was possible at all to still make sure that we didn't create unnecessary logs in tables, but where we could skip the API requests, because those take a lot of time relative to the complete process. So for instance, if we set up the logging level for debug and we had a big file to process or big message to process, that could really tank performance, which is part of the reason why we always say that it's good to set the logging level to information once we get to production. But sometimes for troubleshooting, it might come quite in handy to set it to debug or detailed information. So now, instead of using API requests, or that's still done if we have the beta feature disabled, but if we have it enabled, then we will keep the logging in memory. Of course, there could be some practical limitations. I haven't seen them yet. But if we have really big files and a lot of logging, of course, there could be some limits to the memory consumption in those sessions. So once again, that's the reason that we included this as a beta feature instead of just enable it for all current definitions. But the result of that is that logging is done completely internally within the session. So no external web service calls are required, which could really speed up some of the processing. And still, as before, only if the once the export or import is done or returns an error, then we will write into the logging tables to make sure that that's the only moment that we use those or actually do transactions on those tables, to make sure that we don't unnecessarily lock or block transactions. Well, and just to make sure, once again, for logging, the only thing that I can actually show you is enabling and disabling the beta feature, so I don't think that would be worth it. But are there any questions regarding to the logging feature?
Nope. So let's continue.
Okay, great. So last part before we get to some of the Q&A. New functions. This is something that, well, hopefully speaks for itself, what these functions do, but we have added some new functions simply to make some data manipulation a bit easier, because we, especially last year, we saw a lot of conditional input and output that was required, and in some cases that would result into a list of functions being used for a single a single field, simply to make sure that we could process it, or to make sure that we could allow for multiple scenarios where the input or output needed to be different. So we have included some simple functions that focus on resulting basically in a true or false scenario. So for instance, we have a contains function that simply checks if a current value contains a string or a certain part. For instance, that's something that could be used to check if a value is negative, because that will have a minus sign. But keep in mind that contains will check for text. But then again, if we have a value, a decimal, for instance, and we check that or use the contains function, then it will also be handled as text during the processing of that function. Then we have the is if equal, if greater, and if greater or equal. And similar functions to those are is equal, is greater, and is greater or equal, where those last functions starting with is simply give back a true or false based on a single parameter, and the if functions do the same, but you can simply decide what should be returned if the function returns true or false. So yeah, if we check back here, then we have some functions set up over here. So here we use the is equal. We simply have one parameter, the check value. So we check the current field value or constant value, in this case the previous stored temporary value, and we check that if this is the same as London. We can use temporary values as well to check. In this case, I used a static value. So here we simply check if that center, the responsibility center for that vendor is equal to London, and if that's London, it returns true or yes, and if that's not the case, then it will return no or false. Now here, similar to that, we have the if function, so we use the same temporary value as a starting point, but here we actually check if it's empty. And if it's empty, we set the value to Bristol, and if it's not empty, we set it to Birmingham, just to make sure that we get a difference. Once again, for those values, we could also use temporary values as well, instead of static values. Well, here we only use the set temp file. So with the is greater and if greater, that's pretty much similar. That simply checks if the field value is greater than the value to check against. So in this case, we check if the current value, and so the budget amount, is greater than 0. Something that could also be used, for instance, to check for inventory on items, for instance, where we could check if a current item has inventory left. And then the same, in this case, greater or equal. Here we simply check, what the name already says, if it's greater or equal than 0. So that includes the 0. And this, of course, can also be used because you probably already have seen we don't have an is or if lesser, or if lesser or lesser than equal, because that's something that we can also do with the same functions, but just need to inverse the true or false statements. And the last one that we have included, and this is actually an old one, we already had the pad string function, but the pad string function that fills up the current value up to the length, or if it was longer, it will actually cut it off like a copy string, and we choose the fill character, but that will only align to the right, or fill it up to the right, I should say. And we have included a simple pad left function that allows the same, but the padding is done on the left side. And for the rest, it still works the same. Keep in mind, this is a fill character. We actually do use the pad left function within AL, and that only allows for a single character. So if I were to set up multiple characters, it won't give an error here, but it will give an error when we try to execute that function. And of course, if we create an example, then we can see the results, where you can see the responsibility center is empty in this case. So it's not equal to London. We've set it up that if it was empty, that we would set it to Bristol. The budget amount is 0, so it's not greater than 0, but it is greater or equal to 0. And of course, we have the vendor number padded to the right, and here we have it padded to the left to 10, up to 10 characters. So some basic functions, but hopefully some functions that could make some of the string manipulation a bit easier to make sure that we can process the data with less functions than before. And of course, those functions are available both on the export and import side. And normally, I would ask if there are any questions regarding those new functions, but this is actually also the start for the Q&A session. One thing before we start the Q&A, as was already mentioned, we have some more training sessions. Earlier today we had the direct bank session, and of course this is the ConnectIT session. But Friday or Thursday, sorry, we still have 2 sessions, one for our ShipIT 365 solution and one for the new ApproveIT 365 solution. So if you are still interested, you can go to idyn.nl/news, and you should still be able to join us in those sessions as well. So Q&A. I know at the very least that we have one question.
Yes, Richard. So let's, if you have any questions, put them in the questions tab, and we'll first discuss the following question. When setting up the definitions, are custom extension fields also pulled into the selection?
Okay, so short answer, yes. But maybe it's also best to that I can show this. If we have, first of all, if we go to data items, we have a complete selection for all available tables. So that includes not only the standard tables, but also the tables for third-party solutions. We can actually show you the app name over here. So these are the connected tables actually, but also custom tables. We simply get everything back over here that is available with the current license and permissions. Regarding the fields, pretty much the same. If we have any table extensions, for instance, I don't know if I have anything over here actually. No, I haven't set anything up over here. And I only have ConnectIT actually installed in this environment, so I don't actually can show you this. But here we could also see the custom fields and fields for third parties. Let me check. I probably can show that in a different environment. But before I show that, let me check if I have any data that is not really that's to make sure that I don't show any data belonging to customers on screen. And this goes both ways, both for import and export, of course. As long as the fields are not protected, because there is, of course, also a way to protect your tables and fields from editing outside of your own extension, then it should also be allowed to be processed through ConnectIT. Yeah, this might be a good one. If it opens, yeah, there we go. So this is another demo environment for idyn. However, in this environment, we have multiple apps installed. So if I check, I don't know if we have anything on the item actually. Oh, actually, we do have one belonging to our commerce solution. So these are all visible over here, and I believe in this case we actually have something. For instance, on the sales header, because we also have our ship it solution over here. Yeah, so here we can actually see all fields belong to the ship it extension. So those are all included. We simply check on the all objects and all fields tables to see which fields are available. So if you have a customization also in that same environment, you should also be able to see the fields over there. I hope that answers the question. And if not, please let us know. And
there are no new questions coming in.
okay. Well, that's an easy one then. Of course, if you have any follow-up questions, then it is best to ask them to our sales team, which you can reach with email on our email address sales@idyn.nl. And they will be happy to answer them for you, or give us the questions so that we can answer them for you. So if there are no new questions coming in, I think it's best to end the session because we're nearing 5 o'clock, which was the planned ending of the session anyway. So thank you for joining us. Thanks to Elke as well for joining me. And I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, just thank you, Richard, for hosting this training session. If you have any questions, contact us via sales@idyn.nl, and hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.